June, 1945. Somewhere in the rolling farmlands of Georgia, dozens of captured German women stood in silence, their uniforms replaced by rough khaki dresses. They expected humiliation, maybe hunger, maybe worse. But then an American sergeant placed a plate in front of them: golden fried chicken, steaming biscuits, buttered corn. One woman whispered, "They feed us like guests, not enemies." That meal would change everything they thought they knew about mercy and about America. The air in Bavaria tasted of ash and defeat. Late spring, 1945, the kind of spring where flowers should have bloomed, but only smoke rose from distant hillsides. The Third Reich was collapsing like a building with no foundation, crumbling from the inside out, and everyone knew it except those who refused to see. Liesl Müller had seen it for months, tending to wounded soldiers whose eyes held no hope, only the hollow stare of men who knew they were dying for nothing. She was a Red Cross nurse, 23 years old, her hands permanently stained with iodine and blood, her heart exhausted from holding together what could not be saved. The Americans came on a Thursday morning, not with brutality or vengeance, but with an efficiency that felt almost indifferent. Liesl and 37 other women, auxiliary Luftwaffe personnel, radio operators, medical staff, were rounded up from a makeshift hospital near Munich. No shots fired, no violence, just orders given in English, translated by a nervous interpreter who could barely meet their eyes. Surrender felt like drowning in slow motion, every breath harder than the last. Liesl remembered the propaganda posters plastered across every barracks wall, the ones showing American soldiers as monsters with cruel smiles. The ones that promised humiliation, slavery, things worse than death for women who fell into enemy hands. She looked at the American soldiers now, their faces young and sunburned, exhausted in a different way than German exhaustion. They looked like they wanted to go home. One of them offered her water from his canteen without speaking. She took it because thirst has no loyalty. The water was clean, cold, and tasted like mountain streams she remembered from childhood. It confused her more than anything else that day. Greta Weiss stood beside her, a radio operator with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, whispering under her breath, "This is when it begins. This is when they show us who they really are." But nothing began. They were simply told to wait, to gather what belongings they had, to prepare for transport. The waiting felt worse than anything else. The trucks came at dawn, canvas-covered and smelling of diesel and old metal. 53 women loaded into the backs of 4 vehicles, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their few possessions clutched in arms or shoved into makeshift bags. Liesl found herself sitting across from Greta, their knees almost touching in the cramped space. The bus engine rumbled to life, and the convoy began moving west, away from the ruins of their country, toward an unknown that felt heavier than any certainty. The road stretched endlessly through landscapes that told the story of total war, villages reduced to skeletons of stone and timber, fields cratered and empty, forests stripped bare by artillery fire. Dust rose through the gaps in the canvas, coating their skin, filling their throats, making every breath taste of earth and defeat. Liesl tried to memorize faces, to hold on to the humanity of the women around her, but exhaustion blurred everything into a gray sameness. Some women wept silently, tears cutting clean lines through the dirt on their faces. Others sat stone still, eyes fixed on nothing, retreating into whatever internal spaces they could find. Greta pulled a small photograph from her pocket, creased and fading, a family portrait taken before the world caught fire. She stared at it for a long time before tucking it back against her heart. The smell inside the truck was unmistakable, the metallic scent of fear mixed with sweat and dust and something else Liesl couldn't name. Despair, maybe, or grief. They passed through villages where German civilians stopped to watch. some faces twisted with anger, others wet with tears, all of them witnesses to the end of everything they'd been promised. An old woman spat at the passing trucks. A child waved, not understanding. Liselle closed her eyes but couldn't escape the images burned behind her eyelids, the weight of defeat pressing down like physical force. Greta whispered beside her, "Do you think they'll separate us?" And Liselle had no answer because she knew nothing anymore, except that the world had turned inside out, and mercy was a word that belonged to a different language, a different time. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the changing light filtering through canvas, the occasional stop for water or to relieve themselves under armed guard. No one spoke much. Words felt too heavy to lift. The truck rolled on through the wreckage of a nation, carrying its cargo of captured women toward a destination none of them could imagine, each mile taking them further from everything they'd known and closer to a reckoning they'd been taught to fear more than death itself. The journey took 3 weeks, though later Liselle would struggle to remember the exact number of days. There was a ship, cold and grey, crossing an ocean that seemed endless and indifferent. There were camps along the way, temporary holding facilities where they slept on floors and ate thin soup and waited without knowing what they were waiting for. And then, finally, there was Georgia, the American South in early summer, and nothing could have prepared them for it. The landscape struck Liselle like a physical blow, not because it was harsh, but because it was impossibly, almost offensively alive. Green fields rolled away in every direction, thick with crops she couldn't name, dotted with trees that seemed to stretch toward a sky too blue to be real. The air was hot and heavy, pressing down with a humidity none of them had experienced, but it smelled of growing things, of earth that hadn't been torn apart by trenches and bombs. It smelled of life, not war. Birds sang from telephone wires, loud and careless, as if they'd never heard artillery fire. Wildflowers grew along the roadside in riots of color that hurt to look at. The women pressed against the truck's canvas sides, staring out at this alien world with expressions caught between wonder and suspicion. How could this place exist while their country lay in ruins? How could the sun shine so bright while their families starved among rubble and ash? Greta's voice came out hollow, bitter. They didn't fight the war here, did they? And Liselle understood what she meant. America had sent its sons across an ocean to die, but its soil remained untouched, its fields unburned, its cities whole. The unfairness of it sat heavy in her chest, alongside something else she couldn't quite name, a feeling that felt dangerously close to relief. The POW camp appeared gradually, wooden buildings arranged in neat rows behind wire fencing, guard towers at the corners manned by soldiers who watched their arrival with expressions of practiced boredom. It looked clean, organized, temporary, in the way all military structures feel temporary. Not cruel, not welcoming, just functional. The trucks rolled through the gates and came to a stop in a wide dirt yard where the heat shimmered in visible waves. The women climbed down slowly, legs cramping from the long ride, blinking in the brilliant sunlight like creatures emerging from caves. Liesel's first step on Georgia's soil felt significant in a way she couldn't explain, as if she'd crossed some invisible threshold between one version of herself and another. American soldiers lined the yard, men and women both, their uniforms pressed and clean, weapons held casually but present. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply directed the prisoners toward a long, low building with hand gestures and a few words of broken German. The efficiency of it all was unsettling. Liselle had expected chaos, brutality, the fulfillment of every dark promise whispered in barracks and broadcast over Reich radio. Instead, there was only procedure, clipboard, forms being filled out by bored clerks. The disconnect between expectation and reality created a strange vertigo, a sense that she'd stepped into a world where the rules she'd been taught no longer applied. They were processed like inventory, stripped of everything that marked them as individuals and remade into numbers on a roster. The uniforms they'd worn, however tattered, were taken away, exchanged for simple khaki dresses that hung loose on frames too thin from months of irregular rations. Their hair was checked for lice by a female medic whose hands were gentle but impersonal, efficient without being cruel. Each woman was given a number, called out in English, written on a tag they were instructed to wear around their necks. Liselle became prisoner 427. Greta was 428. The loss of their names felt like a small death, an erasure of identity that the propaganda had promised would come with torture and degradation. But there was no torture, no degradation, just routine. The American guards maintained a professional distance, neither friendly nor hostile, simply present. They gave instructions through interpreters, women who spoke German with various accents, some harsh and some soft, explaining the camp rules, the daily schedule, the expectations for behavior. You will work. You will follow orders. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The words meant nothing to most of the prisoners, who'd been taught that international law was a fiction invented by the weak. Liselle watched the faces around her, seeing confusion and suspicion in equal measure, everyone waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the mask of civility to slip and reveal the monsters underneath. A female sergeant stood before them, American through and through, her uniform crisp despite the heat, her face weathered and stern, but not unkind. She spoke through an interpreter, a young woman with a Berlin accent who'd clearly been in America for years. Listen carefully. You are prisoners of war, but you are also women, and you will be treated as such. You will be given work appropriate to your skills. You will be fed according to military ration standards. You will be housed separately from male prisoners. Any mistreatment by guards is to be reported immediately. You are enemies of the United States, but you are also human beings, and we do not forget that. The words hung in the humid air, almost absurd in their reasonableness. Liselle glanced at Greta and saw her own confusion mirrored there. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Where was the humiliation they'd been promised? Where were the degradations, the casual cruelties, the systematic dehumanization that every poster and radio broadcast had guaranteed awaited them? Instead, there was only this strange, almost bureaucratic courtesy, this insistence on rules and procedures and basic dignity. It was more disorienting than any abuse could have been because it shattered everything they'd been taught to expect, leaving them adrift in a reality that made no sense according to the logic they'd lived by for years. They were marched to the barracks, a long wooden building with rows of bunk beds and thin mattresses, windows that actually opened to let in air, floors that had been swept clean. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't a dungeon either. Just a place to sleep, functional and spare, smelling of pine and fresh paint and something else Liselle slowly recognized as cleanliness. Real cleanliness, not the desperate scrubbing of surfaces in a losing battle against filth and disease. The women claimed bunks silently, each choosing a small territory to call their own, arranging their few possessions with the careful deliberation of people trying to impose order on chaos. Liselle chose a lower bunk near a window. Greta took the one above her without asking, and somehow that small assumption of continued proximity felt like the only familiar thing in this entirely unfamiliar world. Night fell over the Georgia camp, with a chorus of insects and the distant sound of music drifting from somewhere beyond the wire. Jazz, Liselle thought, though she'd never heard it except in snippets on forbidden radio broadcasts, always described by Reich authorities as degenerate, primitive, the product of inferior cultures. It sounded nothing like what she'd been told. It sounded like conversation, like instruments talking to each other in a language that needed no translation, playful and melancholy all at once. She lay on the thin mattress, feeling the heat of the day still radiating from the wooden walls, and tried to understand where she was and what would happen next. Silence filled the barracks, not peaceful, but heavy with unspoken fear and confusion. 53 women lying in the darkness, each wrestling with their own demons, their own propaganda-fueled nightmares about what came next. Some women prayed quietly, whispering words in the dark that might have been comfort or might have been goodbye to whatever they'd been before this moment. Others simply stared at the ceiling, eyes open and unseeing, lost in memories or dread or the strange liminal space between captivity and whatever would come after. Liselle's stomach cramped with hunger, not the desperate starvation she'd known in the final months of the war, but the ordinary emptiness of having missed meals, of burning through the last rations given during processing hours ago. They'd been told food would come in the morning, had been shown the mess hall in their brief orientation, but the promise of food felt abstract, unreal, possibly a lie designed to extract compliance or hope before crushing both. She tried to remember the last good meal she'd eaten and found only memories of thin soup and hard bread that tasted of sawdust and defeat. Greta's voice came from the bunk above, barely a whisper in the darkness. "Tomorrow, they will test us. Tomorrow, we'll see what they really want." The words carried weight, certainty, the grim fatalism of someone who'd accepted the worst and was simply waiting for confirmation. Liselle wanted to argue, to offer some reassurance, but found she had none to give. She'd seen too much of human cruelty to dismiss Greta's fears as paranoia. The kindness so far felt like a trick, a setup, the calm before some storm they couldn't yet imagine. "If they feed us," Greta continued, her voice flat and hard, "I will not eat. I will not take anything from them. I will not be grateful to my captors." The declaration hung in the humid air, defiant and desperate, the last stand of pride against the erosion of everything else. Liselle closed her eyes and said nothing, because what could she say? That hunger would break that resolve soon enough. That pride was a luxury they could no longer afford, that survival might require swallowing more than just American food. She kept her silence and listened to the night sounds, the breathing of 52 other women, the insects singing their indifferent songs, the distant jazz that seemed to come from a different world entirely. Sleep came eventually, restless and full of fractured dreams about falling and drowning and reaching for things that dissolved before her fingers could close around them. And somewhere, in the darkness between exhaustion and dawn, in that space where fear and hope wage their eternal war, something was already changing, already shifting, already preparing these women for a truth they couldn't yet accept. But America's first weapon was not a gun. It was kind, served warm. Morning light cut through the wooden slats of the barracks like blades, thin and golden, marking time on the faces of women who'd barely slept. Liselle woke to birdsong, disorienting and too cheerful, the kind of sound that belonged to a world without war. She lay still for a moment, remembering where she was, feeling the strangeness of it settle over her again like a weight. Then the smell reached her, drifting through the open windows in the humid morning air, and everything stopped. Fried chicken. The scent was unmistakable, rich and savory, mixed with something else. Biscuits, maybe, butter, coffee, real coffee. Not the chicory substitute they'd choked down for years. The aroma filled the barracks like an accusation, too good to be real, too deliberate to be accidental. Women stirred on their bunks, noses lifting like animals catching wind of something they couldn't quite trust. Liesl sat up slowly, watching suspicion ripple through the room in glances and whispered questions. "It must be scraps," someone muttered from across the room. "Leftovers they're giving to the dogs first." Another voice, harder, more bitter. "It's a trick they want to see us beg." They were called to the mess hall by a guard who looked barely old enough to shave, his German halting but earnest as he explained breakfast was ready. "Please form a line. No pushing." The women moved slowly, reluctantly, pride and hunger at war in every step. The mess hall was a long building with rows of tables, clean and plain, smelling of food and coffee so strongly it made Liselle's empty stomach clench, with longing and dread in equal measure. American soldiers ate at tables near the front, their plates piled high, their conversation easy and punctuated with laughter that seemed obscene in its casualness. The prisoners formed a line as instructed, shuffling forward toward a serving station where an enormous black man in a stained apron stood wielding tongs and a ladle with the efficiency of long practice. His face was weathered and kind, his eyes meeting each woman's gaze as they passed, nodding slightly as if acknowledging something unspoken. Liesel reached the front of the line and a plate was placed before her, white ceramic, warm from washing, and what landed on it made her breath catch. Golden fried chicken, 3 pieces, the skin crisp and glistening. Biscuits, 2 of them, steaming and split, butter already melting into the crumbs. Corn, bright yellow and buttered. Coffee, black and hot, poured into a tin cup that was pressed into her shaking hands. She found a seat at one of the prisoner tables, Greta sliding in beside her, both of them staring at their plates like the food might vanish if they looked away. Around them, other women sat frozen, forks in hands, nobody moving, nobody willing to be first. The smell was overwhelming, making Liesel's mouth water, making her head swim with memories of peacetime meals, family dinners, a world where food was abundant and ordinary. Greta lifted a piece of chicken slowly, brought it to her mouth, bit down. The sound of the crisp skin breaking seemed loud in the sudden silence. She chewed once, twice, then stopped, her eyes filling with tears that spilled down her cheeks without permission. Liesel tasted her own piece, felt the flavor explode across her tongue, salt and pepper and something smoky, the meat tender and juicy beneath the perfect crust. It was better than anything she'd eaten in years, better than their own army had fed them even before the collapse, before the shortages and the desperation. She found herself whispering, her voice barely audible. They fed us better than our own army did, and the truth of it felt like betrayal and revelation all at once. Around them, other women began to eat, slowly at first, then faster, hunger overcoming pride, bodies demanding what minds still wanted to refuse. Some women wept while they ate, tears mixing with grease and salt, grief and gratitude impossible to separate. The man who'd served them was Sergeant Harold Jenkins, 42 years old, born and raised in rural Alabama, where poverty had taught him more about hunger than any military training ever could. He'd grown up in a sharecropper's shack, one of 7 children, knew what it meant to go to bed with your stomach eating itself, knew the particular desperation of watching your mother try to stretch nothing into something that could feed a family. The army had been his escape, cooking his unlikely talent, the one thing he could do better than most and well enough to matter. He stood in the kitchen after the breakfast service, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, his mind on the faces he'd seen in the serving line. Young faces, mostly, too thin, carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from sustained fear and deprivation. Enemy faces, technically, women who'd worked for the Reich, who'd supported the machine that killed American boys by the thousands. But Harold Jenkins had learned long ago that hunger doesn't take sides, that suffering strips away ideology and leaves only the raw human need to survive. His own mother had taught him that, handing out cornbread to hobos during the Depression, regardless of their color or creed or whether they deserved it by some arbitrary measure of worth. Another guard wandered into the kitchen, a young lieutenant from Ohio who'd made comments before about coddling prisoners, about how these women should be grateful for anything better than starvation rations. Jenkins didn't look up from his cleaning, just spoke quietly, steadily, the way he always did when making a point that mattered. Food doesn't take sides. Never has. Never will. A person's got to eat, whether they're on your side or against it, whether you like them or hate them. We feed them right because that's what civilized people do, because that's what separates us from what they were told we'd be. The lieutenant had no answer to that, just shrugged and left, and Jenkins went back to his work. He'd cook the same meal every week, fried chicken on Sundays, because he'd learned something in his 42 years that the young lieutenant hadn't figured out yet. You can't change hearts with bullets and barbed wire, but sometimes you can change them with something as simple as a good meal served with basic human dignity. It wouldn't work on everyone, wouldn't erase what these women had done or believed, but it might plant a seed, might create a crack in the armor of hate and propaganda, might remind them that the enemy they'd been taught to fear was capable of mercy. And if that wasn't a weapon worth wielding, Harold Jenkins didn't know what was. The language barrier was a wall between worlds, thick and seemingly impenetrable, but walls have cracks and cracks let light through. It started small, with gestures and pantomime, with American guards pointing at objects and saying English words slowly, with German prisoners doing the same in reverse, a tentative exchange that felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. Lisel found herself gravitating toward a young American nurse named Dorothy, a woman perhaps 5 years older with tired eyes and hands scarred from years of medical work, who seemed to recognize in Lisel a kindred spirit, someone who'd seen too much suffering to maintain the fiction that sides mattered more than wounds. Dorothy brought a small notebook one afternoon, sat beside Lisel in the mess hall after lunch, and pointed at words written in careful block letters. "Thank you." She said it slowly, breaking the syllables apart. "Thank you," and gestured for Lisel to repeat. The words felt strange in Lisel's mouth, the th sound impossible at first, her tongue tripping over consonants that didn't exist in German. "Thank you." She tried again, getting closer, and Dorothy smiled, actually smiled, warm and genuine, nodding encouragement. "Thank you." Third time, better. Dorothy reached over and squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture of congratulation that made Liesel's throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. The lessons spread like a quiet contagion, other prisoners watching, other guards joining in, words exchanged like currency in a market where communication was worth more than pride. "Good morning." "Coffee, please." "How are you?" Simple phrases, basic courtesies, the building blocks of human interaction stripped down to their essential elements. Greta learned water and bathroom with fierce determination, as if mastering the captor's language was a form of resistance rather than surrender. An older woman named Margaret, who'd worked in military kitchens, learned delicious and used it to make Harold Jenkins blush when she thanked him for his cooking, the word awkward in her accent, but sincere in a way that transcended pronunciation. In the evenings, after work, details and dinner, after the sun had set and the Georgia heat had broken into something almost comfortable, they could hear the jazz more clearly. It drifted from the guardhouse where off-duty soldiers gathered, records played on a phonograph that someone had brought from home, music that was forbidden in the Reich but unavoidable here. At first it had seemed alien, chaotic, but Liesel found herself listening differently now, hearing the conversation in it, the way instruments talked to each other, questioned and answered, agreed and disagreed, all within the framework of something that felt like organized freedom. Some of the younger prisoners even swayed slightly when they thought no one was watching, bodies responding to rhythm in ways that ideology couldn't quite suppress. One night, Greta whispered in the darkness, "Do you think if we'd heard this music before, things might have been different and Lisel understood what she meant? If they'd known that the enemy could create beauty like this, could laugh and feed and show kindness, would they have believed the lies so easily? Would they have followed orders so readily? Would anything have changed?" There was no answer, only the music playing on, indifferent to history and politics and the terrible weight of what-ifs that would haunt them forever. But not everyone could accept it. The kindness that felt like accusation, the full plates that demanded gratitude they weren't ready to give. Some women pushed food around their plates without eating, pride stronger than hunger, ideology stronger than biology. Some ate only what was necessary to survive, refusing to enjoy it, refusing to acknowledge that it tasted good, that their captors were feeding them better than their own officers had in the war's final year. Guilt wrapped around them like wire, cutting deeper with every meal, with every small courtesy, with every moment that contradicted everything they'd been taught about who was civilized and who was savage. Greta had found paper, thin sheets torn from a damaged ledger in the supply room where she worked sorting inventory, and a pencil stub short enough to hide in her palm. She wrote at night by moonlight. When others slept, her handwriting cramped and small to save space, recording thoughts that felt too dangerous to speak aloud. How do you hate someone who gives you bread? The question appeared on the page like an indictment, like a confession, like a wound that couldn't heal because it was self-inflicted. She wrote about the fried chicken, about Harold Jenkins' kind eyes, about Dorothy teaching Liesl English with the patience of someone who believed language was a bridge worth building. She wrote about the contradiction of being enemy and human at the same time, of being treated with dignity by people she'd been taught to see as beneath dignity. The internal war was worse than any external captivity because the bars were made of broken belief and the guards were her own memories. Every meal became a moral crisis, every kindness a challenge to everything she'd accepted as true for years. The Americans were supposed to be monsters. That's what made the war righteous, what made the sacrifices meaningful, what made the losses bearable. But monsters don't serve fried chicken with care and concern. Monsters don't teach you their language with patience and smiles. Monsters don't see you as human even when you're their prisoner. And if the Americans weren't monsters, then what did that make her and everyone she'd served beside? It wasn't the food alone, though. The food was the catalyst, the thing that broke through intellectual defenses and spoke directly to bodies that couldn't lie. It was the dignity of being seen, of being treated as if their humanity still existed, despite the uniform they'd worn. Despite the cause they'd served, despite everything that should have marked them as undeserving of basic decency. Some women couldn't bear that weight, chose hunger and hatred because those were familiar, comfortable in their pain. Others slowly began to unbend, began to allow themselves the possibility that the world was more complicated than they'd been told, that mercy could exist alongside justice, that feeding your enemy might be the most powerful victory of all. Liesl watched Greta wrestle with it nightly, saw the pain in her face during meals, the war between body and belief playing out with every reluctant bite. She wanted to help, but didn't know how, couldn't offer absolution she didn't possess, couldn't make the contradictions resolve into something simple and clean. All she could do was sit beside her friend and eat her own meals and quietly acknowledge that everything was different now, that they were different now, that there was no going back to who they'd been before they tasted kindness served warm by enemy hands. The work came as a relief after weeks of waiting and fear, something to do with hands that had been idle too long, minds that had been eating themselves in the absence of purpose. The women were divided according to skills and needs, some assigned to the camp laundry, others to mending uniforms, still others to the garden that supplied fresh vegetables for the mess hall. Liesl and a dozen others were given the garden detail, handed tools and gloves, and led to a plot of land behind the barracks where the Georgia soil was rich and dark and ready to grow anything planted in it with the right care. She knelt in the dirt that first morning, feeling soil under her fingernails, sun on her back, sweat starting to bead on her forehead despite the early hour. The seeds and seedlings they were given were practical, tomatoes and beans and squash, crops meant to feed people rather than decorate spaces. But there were flowers too, marigolds and zinnias planted along the borders, bright spots of color that served no purpose except beauty. except to remind everyone who saw them that life included more than mere survival. Liesel found herself drawn to the flowers, her hands gentle as she transplanted seedlings, her heart unexpectedly light as she watched them settle into their new soil. It was her first act of creation since the war began. She realized with a shock that made her hands pause mid-motion. Years of tending wounds, of trying to save lives that were already lost, of destruction and death and desperate preservation. But this was different. This was planting something that would grow, nurturing something that would bloom, participating in the continuation of life rather than its desperate defense. The simplicity of it broke something open inside her chest, some tight knot of tension that had been there so long she'd forgotten it wasn't natural. She knelt in the Georgia dirt and planted flowers and felt, for the first time in memory, something that might have been hope. The garden became their shared space, a place where language barriers mattered less because the work spoke for itself, where American guards and German prisoners knelt side by side in soil that didn't care about nationality or ideology. One of the guards, a young man from Iowa who'd grown up on a farm, showed them the proper way to stake tomato plants, his hands moving with the unconscious competence of someone who'd learned young and learned well. A prisoner named Anna, who'd worked her family's farm before the war, taught an American nurse how to tell when squash was ready to harvest, pantomiming and pointing, both women laughing when understanding finally clicked into place. And on Sundays, without announcement or ceremony, the fried chicken returned. It became a ritual, something to mark time by, something to anticipate. Harold Jenkins cooked it the same way every week, that perfect golden crust, that tender meat, served with the same biscuits and corn and coffee that had stunned them that first morning. The women stopped protesting, stopped refusing, let themselves enjoy it without the crushing weight of guilt, or at least with guilt they'd learned to carry alongside gratitude. Greta ate her portions now, still wrote in her hidden journal at night, but the questions had changed from accusations to wondering, from how dare they to maybe. Maybe there's something here worth understanding. Liesel tended her flowers and ate her Sunday chicken and learned more English words from Dorothy, and somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary living, she realized she was healing, not from physical wounds, but from something deeper, something she hadn't known was injured until it started to mend. The propaganda had carved out hollow spaces inside them all, filled them with fear and hate and the certainty of righteousness. But kindness, persistent and patient, and offered without conditions, was slowly filling those spaces with something else, something that felt fragile and precious and almost unbearably human. Mercy has a taste, and once you've known it, you can't go back. The news came on a Tuesday afternoon in early May, carried on radio waves and whispered conversations, spreading through the camp like wind through wheat fields. Germany had surrendered. Unconditionally. Completely. The war in Europe was over. Liesel heard it from Dorothy, who'd come to find her in the garden where she knelt among tomato plants, her hands stained with soil and green from stems. The American nurse's face was complicated, relief and sadness mixing in expressions that shifted too quickly to name, and she spoke the words in careful German, making sure Liesel understood. "It's over. Your country has surrendered. The war is finished." Liesel sat back on her heels, dirt falling from her gloves in clumps, and felt nothing. Then everything. The numbness broke like a dam, and emotions flooded through in a chaos that left her breathless, tears coming without permission, her body shaking with sobs she couldn't control or understand. Was it grief? Was it a relief? Was it the terrible weight of knowing that everything they'd sacrificed, everyone they'd lost, every compromise they'd made had been for nothing, for a cause that had crumbled into ash and mass graves and a shame that would stain generations? Dorothy knelt beside her, one hand on her shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing to say, just presence and pressure and the steady breathing of another human witnessing collapse without judgment. The barracks that evening was silent in a way that felt holy and terrible. 53 women processing the end of everything they'd known. Some wept openly, faces buried in pillows or each other's shoulders, grief pouring out in sounds that seemed torn from somewhere deeper than lungs. Others sat stone still, eyes dry and distant, shock creating a buffer between reality and reaction. A few prayed, old prayers learned in childhood before the world caught fire, words that might have been comfort or habit or desperate bargaining with a God who seemed to have looked away for 12 long years. Greta lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling, her voice, when it came, sounding hollow and far away, like it was traveling through water to reach the air. "We lost our country." The words hung there, final and irrevocable, the truth that would define the rest of their lives. Then, quieter, almost wondering, but maybe we found our souls. Liesel didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the question was too big and too small all at once, because finding your soul required first admitting you'd lost it, and that admission felt like standing naked in front of a mirror and seeing all the scars and wounds and places where you'd allowed yourself to be hollowed out and filled with poison. But maybe Greta was right. Maybe this was what redemption looked like, ugly and painful and nothing like the heroic narratives they'd been fed. Maybe mercy had planted something in them that could grow now that the war's shadow had lifted. The announcement came 3 weeks later, delivered by the camp commander through interpreters who spoke with careful neutrality. Arrangements were being made for repatriation. The women would be returning to Germany within the month, processed through reception centers, given basic supplies and documentation, released to find whatever remained of their lives in the ruins of a defeated nation. The news landed with a weight none of them expected. Not joy exactly, but not quite dread either. Something more complicated that sat uncomfortably in chests and stomachs, a tangle of wanting to go home and fearing what home had become. Some women received the news with visible relief, eager to search for family members, to return to familiar ground, even if that ground was now rubble and ash. Others went quiet, their faces troubled, and in the days that followed, Liesel heard whispered conversations in corners, tentative questions asked in voices that trembled with something that might have been hope, or might have been desperation. Is there any way to stay? Could we apply for something, work permits, asylum, anything that would let us remain in this place where we'd been treated like human beings rather than symbols of shame? The questions had no good answers, only the reality of policies and procedures and the fact that America had no need for former enemy soldiers when it had its own people to worry about. Liesel found herself torn, missing Germany with an ache that felt physical, longing for the language and landscape of her childhood, for the possibility of finding her family alive somewhere in the wreckage. But she'd also found something here in Georgia, in this strange interlude between war and whatever came after, a version of herself she hadn't known existed. A woman who could plant flowers and learn new words and accept kindness from people she'd been taught to hate. Who could sit in the evening and listen to jazz without feeling like she was betraying everything she'd ever believed. Going back meant leaving that woman behind, meant returning to a place where mercy might be in short supply and judgment plentiful, where being captured by the Americans might mark her as suspect rather than survivor. Harold Jenkins found her in the garden on a Saturday morning, her hands working automatically among the beans while her mind circled the same thoughts over and over like birds unable to land. He stood at the edge of the plot, his large frame casting shadow across the rows, and when she looked up, he gestured for her to join him. They walked in silence toward a bench near the perimeter fence, sat together, watching the Georgia landscape stretch away toward horizons that held no wire, no guard towers, only fields and forest, and the promise of a world that existed beyond captivity. "You'll be okay," he said finally, his voice carrying the slow certainty of someone who'd seen enough of life to trust his own judgment. "You've got too much heart not to be." The words were simple, almost plain, but they landed like benediction, like permission to believe in her own survival when everything felt fragile and uncertain. Liesel felt tears sting her eyes, managed to whisper, "Thank you," in English, the pronunciation better now after months of practice. And Jenkins nodded, satisfied, as if he'd accomplished something important by giving her those words to carry into whatever came next. They sat together a while longer, not speaking, just two people who'd been on opposite sides of a terrible conflict finding common ground in the basic truth that kindness matters, that seeing each other as human was the only victory that would last after the treaties were signed and the monuments built and the history books written. The farewell feast was Harold Jenkins' idea, though officially it went through proper channels and was approved as a morale event for departing prisoners. Sunday morning, the day before their scheduled transport, the women were called to the mess hall where the smell of fried chicken already filled the air like a memory and promise tangled together. The tables had been arranged differently, more care taken with placement, white tablecloths that weren't regulation but appeared anyway, small touches that transformed the space from functional to intentional, from ordinary meal to deliberate ceremony. Jenkins had cooked all night, his hands moving through familiar motions with the attention to detail of someone who understood this meal carried weight beyond nutrition. The same recipe he'd used that first morning, the one that had broken through walls of fear and propaganda with nothing more than golden crust and tender meat, fried in cast iron with techniques learned from his mother, seasoned with salt and pepper and something that might have been love or might have been the deep human need to nurture even in the midst of enmity. He'd made extra biscuits, real butter pooled in their centers, corn so bright and yellow it looked artificial, coffee strong enough to remind them all what real coffee tasted like before the world learned to make do with substitutes. The women filed in slowly, awareness settling over them that this was ending, that tomorrow they'd be on trucks heading toward ships that would carry them back across an ocean to a country that might not want them, that might see their survival as collaboration, their health as evidence of betrayal. They took their seats and plates were served. The same portions as always, no more and no less, because Jenkins understood that dignity wasn't about excess, but about consistency, about treating people the same on the last day as you did on the first, about never using food as reward or punishment, but simply as the basic human right it should have always been. Liesel lifted her fork and paused, looking at the fried chicken on her plate, seeing not just food, but everything it represented. The first meal that had confused them with its abundance, the Sunday ritual that had marked time and healing, the bridge between enemy and human that had been built one piece at a time with nothing more than proper seasoning and care. She glanced at Greta beside her, saw her own understanding reflected there, the recognition that this had never really been about food at all, that the chicken and biscuits and corn had been vehicles for something much more important, much more dangerous to the ideologies they'd been raised in. "They gave us a meal," Liesel said softly, her voice barely carrying beyond their immediate table, but somehow feeling louder than any speech, "and took away our hate." The words settled over the room like grace. Like truth too simple to be argued with, like the final piece of understanding clicking into place. Around them, women nodded, some crying quietly into their napkins, others smiling through tears, all of them knowing that they were leaving this place different than they'd arrived, that Harold Jenkins and Dorothy and all the others who'd chosen kindness over cruelty had planted something in them that would grow in whatever soil they found themselves in next, seeds of mercy that might, if tended properly, bloom into something that looked like redemption. Germany in the summer of 1945 was a landscape of endings, cities reduced to rubble and memory, infrastructure shattered, populations displaced and starving, the physical manifestation of ideology collapsed in on itself like a building with no foundation. Liesel stepped off the train in what had once been Stuttgart, her papers stamped and processed, her body healthy in a way that marked her as different from the skeletal figures moving through the ruined streets, and felt the weight of judgment settle over her like ash. The whispers started immediately. Neighbors who recognized her despite the months away, faces she'd known her whole life now twisted with suspicion and contempt. "You were captured. You survived. You look well fed." The implications hung unspoken, but clear, that survival meant collaboration, that health was evidence of betrayal, that she must have done something, given something, become something shameful to return in such condition when so many others had died. The word traitor appeared on walls near her. Families bombed out house, painted in crude letters, and Liesel understood that this was her new reality, that the mercy she'd experienced in Georgia would find no echo here, that she'd traded one form of captivity for another. She found paper in the ruins, salvaged from destroyed offices and schools, and wrote in margins and blank spaces, recording everything before it could fade or be revised by self-serving memory. "I was a prisoner, but I was free in America." The sentence appeared again and again in different forms. The paradox at the heart of her experience. The truth that freedom wasn't about location or legal status, but about being seen, being treated with dignity, being allowed to remain human even in the midst of enmity. She wrote about the fried chicken, about Harold Jenkins' kind eyes, about learning English from Dorothy and planting flowers in Georgia soil, about the Sunday rituals that had marked her healing in increments too small to notice until they accumulated into transformation. Greta had returned to Berlin, or what remained of it. Her letters arriving sporadically over the following months, brief and carefully worded because mail was monitored and trust was scarce. She'd hidden her camp photograph, she wrote, not out of shame but protection, because the evidence of American kindness was dangerous in a place where everyone was scrambling to prove their resistance, their suffering, their right to claim victimhood rather than complicity. She kept it wrapped in cloth at the bottom of a drawer, pulling it out sometimes at night to remember that there had been a place, however briefly, where mercy had mattered more than revenge, where feeding your enemy had been considered strength rather than weakness. The years that followed were hard in ways that had nothing to do with physical deprivation. The slow, grinding work of rebuilding lives and nation from ruins, of processing guilt and grief and the particular shame of having believed in something that revealed itself as monstrous. Liesel married eventually, a quiet man who'd spent the war in a different kind of prison and understood, without needing explanation, why some things couldn't be spoken about, why some memories had to be carried in silence. She had children, taught them to cook, found herself making fried chicken on Sundays, even though the ingredients were hard to come by, and the technique was nothing like Harold Jenkins' perfection. Just her attempt to recreate something that had mattered, to pass on a taste of mercy to the next generation even if they couldn't understand why it was important. The journal was found decades later by Liesel's granddaughter, Clara, a university student with curious eyes and her grandmother's determination, sorting through belongings after Liesel's funeral in 1998. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with cramped handwriting in the margins of salvaged paper, dates and places and names she didn't recognize. Clara read late into the night, piecing together a story she'd never heard, a version of her grandmother that didn't match the quiet woman who'd made Sunday chicken and spoke rarely about the war, who'd seemed content in her ordinary life of family and routine. The story of the fried chicken appeared again and again, a through line connecting fear to healing, enemy to human, the simple act of a meal served with dignity becoming the fulcrum on which everything else balanced. Clara read about Harold Jenkins and Dorothy, about Greta and the garden and the jazz that had drifted through Georgia evenings, about the terrible weight of going home to a place that saw kindness as collaboration and survival as evidence of moral failure. She read her grandmother's words, "I was a prisoner, but I was free in America," and understood for the first time what mercy looked like when it was offered without conditions, without demands, without the expectation of gratitude or redemption, just the simple acknowledgement that even enemies deserve to be treated as human. She wrote her thesis on it eventually, though she changed the names and obscured identifying details to protect the living and honor the dead. The story of how small acts of compassion in the midst of total war had changed lives in ways that victory and defeat never could. How a cook from Alabama had understood something that generals and politicians missed, that you can't build peace on starvation and humiliation, that feeding people properly is a revolutionary act when the world expects cruelty, that seeing humanity in your enemy is the first step toward a future where enmity might eventually fade. War divides nations, Clara wrote in her conclusion, but food reminds us what it means to be human. The words echoed her grandmother's journal, tried to capture something essential about the Georgia camp and the women who'd been transformed there, about Harold Jenkins standing in his kitchen believing that food doesn't take sides, about Dorothy teaching English with patient hands, about all the small choices that had accumulated into something that looked like hope. When the Americans said to taste the fried chicken, they weren't just feeding the hungry. They were feeding the idea that mercy can win where bullets fail, that kindness is a weapon more powerful than any in the arsenal of war, that the simple act of preparing a meal with care and serving it with dignity could plant seeds that would bloom across generations, carried forward by people who remembered what it felt like to be seen as human even when everything said they should be treated as less. The taste had stayed forever, passed down in stories and Sunday dinners, in journals hidden in drawers, and theses written by granddaughters who'd never known war but inherited its lessons. Mercy has a taste, golden and crisp and served warm. And once you've known it, once you've really known it, you can't go back to the person you were before. You can only carry it forward. Share it when you can, remember it when you can't, and trust that somewhere in the complicated mathematics of human cruelty and human kindness, the small acts of decency matter more than we'll ever fully understand. The fried chicken had been just chicken, after all, simple and ordinary. But it had also been everything, a bridge across enmity, a seed of redemption, proof that even in the darkest times the human capacity for mercy endures, waiting to be expressed in the most unexpected ways by the most unexpected people, changing hearts one meal at a time.